So today we're going to be talking about ferrules. What are they? How do you pick them? How do you put them on? And how do you finish them the right way? Let's go. Hi everyone, it's AJ, the Mobile Club Maker. Thanks as always for watching this video. If you enjoy it, please like it, share it, or subscribe to the channel. So I was going back and looking at some of the videos I've done, and I realized I haven't done a ferrule video, which is kind of important. It's a big part of club making. So I figured, well, let's go ahead, get that done. I haven't put a lot of videos out recently. It's been hot, it's been summertime. My shop gets pretty darn warm in the summer. So it's finally getting a little bit cooler. I can get back out here a little more often, doing this one early in the morning so it's not too hot. So let's talk about ferrules. Like I said in the intro, we're going to be talking about 4 different things. We're going to talk about what a ferrule is. We're going to talk about how do you pick the right one. We're going to talk about how do you put it on the club. And finally, how do you finish it? How do you make it look nice and professional like a club off the rack? So first off, let's talk about what is a ferrule. This right here is the ferrule. This little piece of black plastic between the hosel of the head and the shaft. Right here, usually plastic, can be different sizes, can be different colors, can have different patterns on it, but it's basically a little tapered piece of plastic meant to join the shaft and the head together purely in a cosmetic sense. It serves zero actual function. This club will work exactly the same whether this ferrule is on it or not. It's a purely cosmetic piece. It's the vestigial organ of the golf club, basically, left over from back when they were joining club heads and shafts together with whipping, basically a twine or a cord to help hold them together because the bond wasn't very strong. Modern golf clubs, modern epoxy, modern bore-through hosels, you don't really need it. However, golf club manufacturers keep using them. They keep designing heads that require ferrules. So if you're going to be doing any club work, any golf club repair, any custom club work, it's something you need to be able to do because basically at this point, every major manufacturer is using ferrules, especially in their irons. Picking a ferrule is going to be based on a few different things. First off, and most importantly, is you want to make sure you get the dimensions right. The size of the ferrule. You know, you look at a ferrule like this, some are taller, some are shorter, some are wider, some are more narrow. The two most important things, the two most important measurements when you're picking out a ferrule are the outside diameter and the inside diameter. The outside diameter being the widest part that sits up against the hosel of the shaft. The inside diameter being the size of that opening right there. Now, why are those two things important? Well, when you're picking out a ferrule, you want to make sure first off that the outside diameter is similar to the outside diameter of the hosel. That being, you want the hosel and the ferrule to be about the same size. You don't want the ferrule sticking way out past, and you don't want the ferrule being way too small where you can see the edge of the hosel. You want it basically, if you can get them identical, that's great. If not, get them slightly larger. Get the ferrule slightly bigger than the hosel. And we'll talk about how you deal with that further on down this video. But that's the most important thing. So figure out what size hosel you've got. Either look at the spec sheet on the club or get out a caliper and measure it. And when you're looking at ferrules, the ferrules will tell you in their description how wide they are, and you want to try and match that up. The second thing we want to talk about is the inside diameter, or the ID. The inside diameter refers to, like I said, the size of the hole. You need to have the inside diameter be the same size as the shaft you're using. Well, there's 4 basic shaft sizes that you're going to be dealing with. In irons, there's .370, also known as parallel, or .355, also known as taper. The taper, and I think we've talked about this in other videos, It's basically the very, very tip of the shaft just tapers in a little bit. So they're two slightly different sizes. So when you're picking a ferrule, if you have a 370 shaft, you want to make sure that your inside diameter of the ferrule is also 370. Likewise, if you have a 355 ferrule, you want to make sure that your ferrule is the same size. Now, one caveat to that, because of the way that taper tip ferrules, because of the way taper tip shafts are designed, only the very bottom section is actually tapered. And once it gets past that, the shaft goes back to being 370. So in most cases, you can actually take a 370 ferrule and put it on a 355 taper tip shaft, and it will fit perfectly, because by the time the ferrule is up on the shaft where it naturally wants to sit, which is about 1.25 inches or so up once the shaft is inserted into the hosel, that section of the shaft is 370. So you can get away with putting a 370 ferrule on there. In fact, in many cases, those 355 ferrules are a pain in the neck to get onto the shaft, because even though it's 355 at the tip, it starts to widen out, and all of a sudden that ferrule is a lot harder to slide on. So those are your iron sizes. Your wood sizes, 0.335 and 0.350. These you want to make sure you can't go back and forth with them. If you have a 335 shaft, you need a 335 ferrule. If you have a 350 shaft, you need a 350 ferrule. You don't want to interchange them. In general, modern golf clubs in the last 5-10 years have pretty much done away with using 350 size shafts. So you're not going to see them so much on new equipment. You may see some if you're reshafting some older equipment from 10, 15, 20 years ago. They were much more willing to put a 350 shaft in those. So make sure you know the size of your shaft, get the caliper out, measure the shaft if you have any questions, to make sure you get the right size ferrule. After that, what's left? Well, now you want to talk about more the cosmetic details of it. You've got the size, which is something that has to be right. After that, it's more cosmetic. Some ferrules are going to be shorter or medium size, some are going to be taller, some will be really short. This is all going to come down to personal preference. In most cases, what usually ends up happening is whatever was on the club previously, you're usually going to go with something similar. If it had a long ferrule, like a wedge does like this, you'll probably replace it with a long ferrule. If it had a shorter ferrule, you'll usually replace it with a shorter ferrule. If it's an individual club from a set, somebody breaks a 6-iron and you need to reshaft just their 6-iron, well, obviously you want to match it up as closely as possible so that the ferrule in the 6-iron looks like the ferrule in the 7-iron, in the 5-iron, in the rest of the set, for continuity's sake. If, however, you're building a set from scratch, or you're building a new driver, things like that, well, you can pick out whatever ferrule you want. If you want a short ferrule, pick a short ferrule. If you want a long ferrule, pick a long ferrule. If you want a blue ferrule with stripes on it, go ahead, knock yourself out. You know, it's up to you. Like I said, there's a lot of ferrule choices out there now. It's not just black of different heights and maybe with a ring of white around it. There's a lot of different options out there, so you can really customize it if you're interested in doing that. Again, just make sure that you're getting the right inside diameter, ID, and the right outside diameter, OD. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is installing the ferrule. How do we get the ferrule on the shaft, get it in the right position to glue it up, and have a ready-to-go club? You know, I think a lot of people, when they're getting into club making, club building, they're moving along, everything's going smoothly, and then they hit the ferrule, and the ferrule gets stuck, and they can't get it on, and it's freak out time. They can't figure out what's going on, why isn't it working? So we're going to try and cover very simply what you need to be able to do it the right way, make it very simple that you can do it and not have any worries about it not being done correctly or getting stuck. So like we've already talked about, the first thing you want to make sure is you have the size right. You've got that outside diameter correct for the hosel. You've got the inside diameter correct to match up with the shaft. And at that point, you pick out whatever it is you want to pick out, whether it's a long black ferrule or a little short ferrule, something with some color in it, whatever it is. You've got your ferrule, you've got your head, and you've got your shaft. Now in some cases, you'll be able to just take the ferrule and slide it onto the shaft, and it'll just slide right into place very easily. Sometimes it just works out that way. It's one of those things. Oftentimes with a steel shaft, you're going to have better luck than with a graphite shaft. Graphite shafts, you're also dealing with not only the graphite portion, the carbon fiber portion, but you're also dealing with paint. You know, they paint the shafts to make them look nice, but that paint adds extra layers, extra thickness. And so when you go to put a ferrule on, all of a sudden, you may have the tip of the shaft prepped, but you've only prepped it, say, 1.5 inches, and all of a sudden, the end of that ferrule butts up against that graphite paint and it gets stuck. But like I said, with a steel shaft, often it'll just slide on very easily. This one slides on very simply. Truth be told, this is a taper tip shaft and this is a 370 ferrule, so it's going to slide on pretty easily. That being the case, you can slide it on just like this. How do you know you've got it on far enough? I like to use the actual head. You take the head, after you've put the ferrule on, remember the wide section is going to be pointing towards the tip of the shaft. So what do you do here? Put the head on, set the shaft into the hosel until it bottoms out, goes as far in as it's going to. In some cases, if the ferrule is tight, I'll take it, give it a little tap on the ground to make sure I get it all the way down. And now I know when I take it off, the ferrule's in the right position for this head. You want to make sure you use the head you're going to be gluing with the shaft you're going to be using. You don't want to be mixing them around, because occasionally one head may be a little bit deeper on the bore than another one, and all of a sudden you'll go to glue them together and you'll realize, wait a second, this ferrule is sitting 1/4 inch further down than it should be, and then you're scrambling. So use the head that you're going to be using with the shaft that you're going to be using. Make sure you match everything up when you're fitting it together. Let's say this ferrule isn't going on this shaft. Let's say you try and get it on and it just, either you can't get it over the tip or you just get it on that first little bit and then it's stuck there. You've got a couple different ways to deal with that. One option that works well is you just get a bowl, a little bowl of hot water. Get a little microwave safe bowl, put some water in it, microwave it for a minute or whatever. You don't want it to be boiling, but you want it to be pretty hot. Take it out, take your ferrules, drop them in the water, let them sit in there for 30 seconds to a minute. It'll soften up the plastic a little bit, make them a little more malleable, and you should be able to then slide them onto the shaft a little easier. Also, just that water being on there will act as a little bit of a lubricant and hopefully get it on there a little easier. The other option is you can either buy or make some sort of ferrule installing tool. If you go to a club making website or some golf shops, you'll see these. It's basically a way to fit the ferrule onto the shaft, basically either a tube or a little countersunk block of metal of some kind. They'll cost you, I don't know, between $5 and $15, or you can just make one yourself. This is all I did. I had this piece of scrap wood laying around and I drilled some holes in it. You want to make sure that the holes are bigger than the biggest shaft diameter you'd be using. So bigger than 0.370 inch, but smaller than what the ferrule opening, the outside diameter, would be. So something slightly bigger than 0.370 in a drill bit size would be ideal. Whatever that comes out to fractionally, you can do that math. Once you do that, basically just drill a hole all the way through it, and now you've got a little tool you can use. I'm going to show you on my second camera here exactly what we're going to do. All right, so all we do here, just like before, we take the ferrule, put it onto the tip. You should hopefully be able to at least get it on a tiny bit. From there, you're just going to take it, line the ferrule up over the hole, and then just start pushing the shaft down. Once you get about, honestly, once you get about 1/2 inch on, 3/4 inch on, that's more than enough. At that point, you can switch, stop using the block, and switch to the club head you're going to use instead. Take the club head and, just as before, put the club head on and use the tapping down method till the ferrule goes on to the right depth and you're ready to epoxy. When you're doing this and you're tapping it down, you can hear it. You can listen. It'll make a different sound once that shaft bottoms out and hits the bottom of the hosel. It'll sound different, so you'll know it'll sound tap, 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 and then it'll sound different. And that's when you know, okay, it's gone far enough. Now at this point, like we've covered in other videos, epoxying it is basically just like any other epoxy job. The ferrule is already on here. It's set in the right spot. It's hopefully not going to be moving around. It should be pretty snug if you have the right size. When you do your epoxying, you're going to epoxy inside the hosel as always, and you're going to use just a little thin layer of epoxy all the way from the tip of the shaft right up to the edge of the ferrule, all the way around. And that epoxy is not only going to hold the head on, but it's going to hold the ferrule in place also once you've glued it. Okay, so we've taken the golf club, we've epoxied it together, the ferrule's on there, but now we have to turn down the ferrule. We're finishing off the ferrule because right now, if you remember, the ferrules that we used are sometimes going to be too big. Now, if your ferrule is on the small side, you don't have to do anything with it. It's ready to go. And if it's a perfectly flush fit and it's nice and even and level on all sides, then you're good to go. However, if your ferrule is like this one and it's hanging over the edge, the lip of the ferrule sticks out further than the hosel, well, we need to go and turn that down. We need to remove this material to get the ferrule sitting nice and flush with the hosel, give it that professional look. So what do we need to do that? What tools do we need? Well, if you've gone online and you've looked up turning ferrules before, you've probably seen videos, and most of them involve a belt sander. Let me just go ahead and tell you this right now. If you have a belt sander, by all means, go ahead and use it if you feel comfortable with it. However, if you don't have a belt sander, you by no means are going to need a belt sander to do anything I'm going to show you today. In fact, I don't have a belt sander in my shop. I don't need it, I don't have space for it, so I just don't use it. I'm going to show you how to do this by hand, the tools you'll need, and you by no means need any sort of electrical sander to get the job done. You will get the job done exactly the same doing it by hand as with a belt sander. Again, if you have a belt sander, great, use it, but if you don't feel like you have to run out and spend $400 on a belt sander or whatever they cost just so you can go and turn down ferrules. It's not necessary. What you are going to need, first off, like so many things in club building, you're going to need a vise. You need something to hold the shaft with, a vise and a rubber vise clamp. Today, I'm going to be using actually my shaft extractor as my vise clamp, just for speed's sake. I can move this much more quickly, get shafts in and out, versus wrenching on the actual vise. It's purely a matter of speed though, so if you've got the plain vise and the vise clamp, use that, you're good to go. Second, you're gonna need sandpaper. I like two different sizes. I've got a medium grit sandpaper, which is around 120 grit, and I have a fine grit sandpaper, which I believe is around 300, 320, something like that. Much more fine finishing type sandpaper. Notice also I've cut them into much smaller pieces. This is purely so I can see what I'm doing, be a little more intricate, be a little more detail oriented. I don't have a giant sheet of sandpaper blocking my view, so I can't see what kind of progress I'm making on it. Also, some masking tape, always a good thing to have if you need to protect any sort of paint on the shaft or any sort of finish on the head. It's a good thing you can wrap it around it. You don't have to worry about accidentally sanding some of that finish off. Last couple things, acetone and some grip solvent. We're going to use these at the very end to bring back the shininess of the ferrule. Finally, a couple pieces of paper towel, so you've got something to put the acetone and the grip solvent on with. And I always like to use rubber gloves, neoprene gloves, whenever I'm working with acetone. I just don't like to handle it with my bare hands. So if you pick up a box of these, you'll use them all the time. They come in handy, and I like to use them with the acetone. So the first thing we're going to need to do is lock our golf club into the vise. As we've said, right now, this golf club has a little too much material on this ferrule. It's sticking out. It doesn't look very professional, so we want to get that excess material off there. So first thing we're going to do, I'm going to lock it into the vise. I'm locking it in toe-up position. You can lock it in any way you want. Just know which way you've started it so you know when you've gone all the way around, and I'll come back to that in a second. Okay, I'm going to turn on my second camera so we have another view of this. You can get a little better view of what I'm doing as we're doing it. Okay, so here's the first thing we're going to do. Because this ferrule here has a pretty good amount of material hanging over the edge. That's a pretty fat lip sitting there. We're going to start off with our medium grit sandpaper. In some cases, if the ferrule is pretty close to being flush right from the get-go, you can go directly to the fine, extra fine sandpaper. In this case, we've got a good amount of extra material there, so we want to move a lot of material out of the way. We can use this thicker medium grit sandpaper. Here's the process I use. We're going to take the sandpaper, kind of hold it over the top, and we're just going to work it back and forth across the ferrule, just putting gentle pressure and pulling down, so maybe say about 45 degrees of the ferrule is in contact with the sandpaper, 45 to 55 degrees. We're going to do this about 8 to 10 seconds, stop, turn it 90 degrees, do it again, keep going through that process. So here's what it's going to look like. So we'll start off medium pressure. If you're worried about doing it too hard, start off gentle, see how much it removes. If you feel like it's not doing enough, you can use more pressure. I've done it for about 8 to 10 seconds. I've now turned it 90 degrees. Same thing. That's about another 10 seconds. Turn it, another 90 degrees. As you're going through the process, make sure you feel the ferrule. Feel how much material you're moving off so you know if you need to be doing it harder or if you need to go a little longer before you turn it. Another 10 seconds. Now for me, with this ferrule, I decided I want to go ahead and have a more consistent taper all the way from the tip to the base of it. So I'm sanding the entire thing. Notice I'm sanding up at the top all the way down to the bottom to try and get a more consistent taper versus that parallel section. Again, in this case, it's just personal preference. Okay, so that's 3 out of the 4 sides. Now we're going to turn it the last 90 degrees and finish off this 4th side. Okay, so now you can feel around it. That feels pretty good. I don't feel any real lip. The connection, the joint between the ferrule and the hosel is pretty subtle at this point. At this point, we can switch to the fine grit sandpaper. It's going to be the same process we used before, going across the ferrule, same amount of pressure, same kind of pulling it around it to get about 45 to 50 degrees of it at a time, rotating the head around. You want to do it a little bit shorter this time. You don't need to go 10 seconds. You can go 5 to 7 seconds. So, okay. Now we're going to rotate it again. Okay. We're going to rotate it again. Okay. And rotate it one more time. Okay. Again, feel all the way around it. If you feel like there's any sort of edge sticking up still, you can go back. You can go back with the medium grit sandpaper if you need to, or you can go back with the fine grit sandpaper. This feels pretty good right now. Okay, next step. We're going to take it out of the vise. Here's what it looks like at this point. Basically, the shape is good, but as you notice, the color is not. It's all dull. It's not shiny like it was in the beginning. So now we need to go and bring that color back. Okay, next step, I'm going to put one of these gloves on. Now before I do the acetone, and again, this is just how I work on this, I like to take a little of my grip solvent and spray it, or pour it, or whatever the mechanism is for your bottle. Spray a little of it on a paper towel and just let it sit and sort of soak into the paper towel so it's just the slightest bit damp. You don't want it soaking with grip solvent. And now I'll sit this back over here so I have it. All right, at this point, we're going to get the acetone. I'm going to put it on this paper towel. Now acetone dries really quickly, so you have to move at a pretty good pace, otherwise it's going to dry out and you have to start over again. I'm going to put the acetone on the paper towel, and then I'm just going to work it around the ferrule in the opposite direction I was sanding. So we were sanding going across it like this. We're going to do the acetone going in an up and down manner like this. basically just gently wiping the acetone across the ferrule. Very gently, you're just sort of getting the acetone to touch the ferrule and letting the acetone do the work and shine that ferrule back up, remove that excess material. Here's what that looks like. A little bit of acetone on the paper towel, and then just sort of wipe and turn, wipe and turn, wipe and turn. I'll usually go around a couple times depending on the ferrule and just kind of look at it. You're basically just looking to smooth out all those slightly rough edges from the sanding. Okay, when it gets to be about where you want it, and you can see all that material that comes off there, I'm going to move over, use a cleaner part of the paper towel and do a little bit more, and then switch to my grip solvent paper towel. And this is the method I use. I just sort of pinch it and spin it, kind of buffing the ferrule out to give it a bit of a shine. And at the end of it, you should have something that looks like this. So we've got, notice, a nice, consistent, level feel from the hosel to the ferrule. You don't feel any ridge, it's not sticking over. It's also nice, shiny, you've got the shine back. You can take that grip solvent here, towel, and just sort of wipe the shaft off a little bit to get that excess material off there. And that's it right there. Okay, so there you have it. We've gone through the entire process. We've talked about what a ferrule is. We've talked about how you pick the right one. Remember, the most important things are getting those sizes right. That inside diameter to match the shaft and that outside diameter to match the hosel of whatever head you're going to be using. Then you can pick out the ferrule that matches the set or pick out something new and different, whatever you want to do. Installing the ferrule, if you've got the size picked out the right way, it shouldn't be too difficult. Maybe use a little bit of hot water to soak the ferrules, get them to slide on a little easier, or make yourself a little block like this to help install the ferrules. Once you've got them all epoxied on, we talked about how to turn the ferrules down. Like I said, you can use a belt sander, does the exact same thing we just did here, just does it a little bit faster. But if you're worried about messing it up and not wanting to go too far with it, or if you don't have a belt sander, the sandpaper method works just as well, gives you a result that's just as good, just as clean, just as professional, just like that. All you needed, a couple sizes of sandpaper, some acetone, some towels, maybe a little grip solvent, and some masking tape. And that's it. Hopefully this gives you a little more confidence next time you go to build a golf club and you get to that point where you're dealing with the ferrules. Like I said, you know, the ferrules aren't something that really have any function in the golf club other than cosmetic at this point, but they don't seem like they're going away. We're gonna have to keep dealing with them, so you might as well know how to deal with them the right way and get them looking as good as you can. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like it, share it, or subscribe to the channel. And until next time, keep it in the short grass.